Good morning, good afternoon, and welcome to today's Workforce webinar. My name is Alec, and as always, I'm here today to help answer any of your general or technical questions that may pop up during today's presentation. But before we get started, I'm going to cover a couple of things you need to know about the session today. There's no dial-in number for attendees, so all audio will be streamed to you through your computer speakers or headphones. Please adjust your volume there accordingly. At any point during today's presentation, please feel free to submit questions. You can do so by clicking on the Q&A icon located on the right-hand side of your screen. You can see what that icon looks like here on this slide. Click there, type your question in, and click Submit. And if it's content related, we should have a little bit of time for questions at the end of today's presentation, and we'll pull a couple of your attendee questions at that point. And if it's a technical question, I'll have an answer for you that should appear on your screen shortly after you submit. You can feel free to familiarize yourself with that section right there by letting us know where you're joining from. We already have a couple people doing so. Veronica from Massachusetts, and then Jonathan from right here in Chicago. And yeah, Jonathan, I see your note about in the snow. I'm also not very happy about the snow today, but hey, what can we do, right? So right now you can download a PDF of the slide deck to follow along and take notes if you'd like. Just click that handout icon and you can pull down that PDF to take notes if you like. Today's webinar is being recorded. You're going to receive a link to that recording in a follow-up email about 24 hours after the conclusion of today's event. It will come from HCM Events, and in that same email, you'll have a link to the slides as well as your HRCI and SHRM certification codes for today's event. All right, so today's event, the business case for investing in workplace belonging. I'm excited for today's presentation, and I'm excited to be joined by a couple of great speakers. You can see them both there on your screen. First, we have Dr. Gabriella Rosen-Kellerman. Gabriella is the Chief Innovation Officer at BetterUp and leads BetterUp Labs, a first-of-its-kind behavioral research lab bringing together business, academia, and science to study the inner lives of workers in order to craft coaching interventions that drive optimal performance. And with Gabriella, you can see him there as Andrew Reese, Dr. Andrew Reese, and he is the behavioral data scientist at BetterUp, where he works to advance BetterUp's basic and applied sciences research programs. So enough from me, everybody. I'm excited to hear what Gabriella and Andrew have for us. So with that, Gabriella and Andrew, let's take it away.
So today we're going to share an overview of the findings that we've conducted here at BetterUp Labs over the last year or so on the topic of workplace belonging. And this is the follow-up to the meaning and purpose study that we conducted, and you may have seen or heard about last year. One of the really interesting trends in that study from last year was the connection between social support in the workplace and the feeling that a person belongs at that organization and meaning and purpose. And we had already been independently interested in the topic of belonging in the workplace, and so this became a really natural focus for our next survey. Many of you joining us today may be interested in the topic of belonging because of its close relationship with the topic of inclusion. And so it's worth a minute here at the top to just explain what we mean by belonging, because there are a number of different definitions out there. So some of the definitions of belonging focus on this idea of social connection, which is a pretty broad concept, and has to do with the extent to which we feel that there's a group that we have connections to, that's available to us as a broader community. It's more about our broader sense that there are folks around that we have available and can access when we need to. Another definition of belonging has to do with inclusion, as we mentioned. And inclusion is not just about the availability of connections, it's really about our internal experience that others have included us and accepted us as a deep part of that group. A third definition of belonging is this idea of mattering. So it's this idea that the group that we're part of really values our contributions. That's a different kind of belonging. And finally, we have this idea of organizational identification. So that type of belonging is really about whether we feel that the organization that we belong to is something that we're proud to belong to. It's something that's kind of a part of our broader identity. So Of all of these, the one that maps most closely to our interest here at BetterUp is this idea of inclusion and acceptance. So like many of you, we really care immensely about whether people at work are feeling accepted by others. And we believe there's still a great amount of work to be done to show that this matters. There's a paucity of literature that's making this solid business case that we all need for the fact that feeling accepted at work produces better business outcomes. So that was one of our key aims in the study. And we wanted to give all of you, all of our partners, all of you joining us today, the ammunition that you need to be able to go to colleagues and fellow stakeholders, decision makers, and really prove that this topic is worth paying attention to because it does indeed impact the bottom line. A second goal of ours was to see what can be done about this. So there's quite a lot of money that's spent helping with inclusion. And unfortunately, the vast majority of those efforts are not effective. We all have a sense that we know how it feels to be included. We have a sense that we know what we do differently when we're trying to make others feel included. And so there's a lot of this common sense out there and practices that are rooted in this common sense. A lot of well-intentioned programs have been designed in that way rather than being based on evidence and science. And unfortunately, they have failed to impact the outcomes of interest. So our belief is that there is a scientific way to approach this work, leaning on experimental behavioral science, as we'll share today, where we can try out different interventions, measure outcomes, and then scale the interventions that actually work and have the impact. So our aspiration, as you'll see, was to test a number of interventions, measure that impact, and then share that out with our coaches and our members, which we've done. And now that we've done that, we're excited to share the findings more broadly with all of you today. All right, so there were two phases to the study. The first I'll cover is a correlational phase, and the second, which Andrew will cover, was experimental. So the correlational phase, we started with 1,900 US workers, and we asked them a host of different questions about how much belonging they feel in the workplace. This is a look at the demographics of those who participated. There's a nice kind of socioeconomic distribution, age distribution, gender distribution of full-time employees across the United States. So as I mentioned, we asked these 1,900 people a slew of questions about belonging, about their values, about their work and their home life. And I'm going to highlight here the findings that relate to the business case belonging, but I will mention that there were a ton of really interesting other findings beyond this. One interesting factoid is if you look at the sense of belonging by education level, people who have the highest levels of education in the workplace tend to feel they belong the least. So just to give you a sense of the different types of nuance you can start to draw out of this kind of a study. All right. Well, in short, belonging is good for business. So this is the correlational phase. If you compare workers who score in the top quartile in their belonging scores, meaning they feel that they belong the most at work, with those who feel they belong the least at work, you see that the people with the highest degree of belonging at work have about a 50% reduction in their turnover risk. They have a 56% increase in their job performance, and then 75% fewer sick days. So those are some of the outcomes for companies. Belonging is good for the individual employees too. So we see that there's about 18 times greater promotions for people who feel that high degree of belonging, and about 2 times greater raises for those who feel that high degree of belonging. You may be wondering at this point, how do we know what causes what? So someone who gets a raise is probably more likely to feel that they belong at their organization and on their team. And that is a fair question, and that's what we're going to get to in the experimental part of this study. But even before we get there, it's just generally good to know that these things hang together. The belonging pairs with good outcomes, both for the individual and for the organization. Finally, perhaps not surprisingly, but it's good to quantify that people who feel that they belong at work have much higher net promoter scores for their organizations. So they encourage others to work at the same place. They feel really good about their businesses, their organizations. Now, in order to figure out this, what's causing what here, is high belonging causing the great outcomes, or is it that people who are having this sense of success at the organization feel they belong? We launched this separate experimental study that Andrew's now gonna chat with us about. I want to just mention for any experimentalists or psychologists listening in on this call that the work was all done under the auspices of the IRB that we work with. It was done here at our lab at BetterUp, and we're very grateful to a number of our mentors and scientific advisory board members for their guidance along the way. So let me hand it to you, Andrew.
Great, thank you, Gabriella. So yeah, that's exactly right. How we got off started here was with this good survey work, and we felt we really needed to do that first, just so we could connect the dots that we were already pretty sure were there between belonging and inclusion and these key business outcomes. And it was rewarding to see that those things panned out in our data. But that's kind of like the foundation of any scientific building we're going to build. We first want to make sure that at least the connections are there, even if, as Gabriella said, we're not sure necessarily which way those connections go and what causes what. So the next step after that, once we know that there's something going on here, is to try and design an experiment where we can truly say, as a result of the experiment, that we know that A causes B. And certainly what we're hoping in this case is that we can show that increasing or reducing a sense of belonging actually causes some of these key organizational and business outcomes, both at an organizational and at an employee level. So that's what we did. We conducted a series of experiments. And when I say experiment, I mean a randomized experiment where we're following kind of classical design principles that let us suss out exactly what's the causal influence in any given design. So we conducted a series of experiments, and we looked at how are teams affected. First, when team members feel like they do or do not belong. And this isn't, we're not the first to look at belonging per se. There is some literature in psychology dating back for a couple of decades now, and here's what we know so far. So there tends to be two common responses to getting left out of a group. One of them is basically the idea that, well, people are always trying to figure out, why did I get left out? And one common thought is maybe the others in my group just didn't see my true value. They didn't get how good I was. So if I just work even harder for them, maybe I'll kind of shine and they'll see my value, and then I'll get back in their good graces. That's what they call a pro-social response. So actually seeming to act even more positively towards the group that left you out. The other alternative, also rather intuitive, is if the group leaves you out, you want nothing to do with those guys, so you'll go somewhere else, and that's more of an anti-social response. And both the pro-social and anti-social responses to exclusion do show up a lot. So what we don't quite know yet is exactly under what circumstances do we see those types of behaviors, and then more importantly, how do we protect against the experience in the first place? Now, you see I've got this word unbelonging here. It's sort of a BetterUp coined term that we came up with, because there isn't really a great term for the opposite of belonging. So basically when we playfully say unbelonging, we mean the experience of being excluded or left out. So that's sort of what we set out to tackle with these experimental designs. In any experiment where we want to study inclusion and exclusion, the very first step is to find a reliable way to induce an experience of inclusion or exclusion for all the participants in our study. Now, we conducted all these studies online, and so what we did is we had participants assigned to these small ad hoc teams of 3. And we said, okay, there's a bunch of other people online, and we're going to match you all up at once to be on a team, a new team. You don't know any of these people. Now, in terms of actually inducing this feeling of belonging, believe it or not, the most successful way to do that psychologists have been using for almost 20 years now is to have people play a simple game of catch. So there's you each control an avatar on screen. It's like a very simple video game, and you're just tossing a ball around for, let's say, 2 or 3 minutes or so. And basically the way that everybody treats each other, either fair and equitably or sort of people going off on their own and not really including someone else, that really has a profound effect on people. in terms of how they feel afterwards. Now, I should pause here and say that the point here wasn't so much to have a ball toss game. We're not trying to imply that that has a direct mapping onto something that you might experience on a team at work. The goal with the manipulation was to get people in a state of feeling excluded or included, and then to start and see, well, what are the downstream effects of that that may have very clear analogs to what happens in the workplace. So that's why we set things up that way. There's one catch to this design though, and that's that our participants, which were real people, of course, were told that they were getting matched up with other real people to have these small teams form. And that wasn't accurate. In fact, all of the two other people on their 3-person teams, they were just bots that we programmed to behave in a certain way. And so the bots were programmed in one of two manners. Either the people in blue here, those are our computer programs, they were programmed to be inclusive. In other words, whenever they got the ball, they would toss it an even amount of times between that one human participant in orange and then the other computer program. Or the bots were programmed to behave exclusively. So in the beginning, maybe the human participant got the ball once, and then after that, it was just sort of a tea party back and forth between the two bots. And so in the meantime, the human's just watching this happen, and it's becoming very obvious that they're no longer included in the team game. So that's kind of the setup. And afterwards, and I said this went for about 2 minutes or so, afterwards we checked in with people just to make sure that people weren't spaced out or not getting it. We said, how did you feel? People said awful, they got excluded. We said, did you feel ignored? People said yes, they were excluded, and so forth. So that kind of manipulation check told us that this setup had the effect that we wanted to have. Okay, so now comes the more interesting thing. What we wanted to do is get people in that state where they're feeling either included or excluded from their team. Now we're curious to know, well, now that you feel like that, how hard are you willing to work for that team that you just met and that you just played that game with? So we gave them a second task after that first one. And this was just a simple repetitive task where you're adding single-digit numbers together, a very simple thing that everybody can do. However, we told them that every once in a while, there was going to be a real cash prize for getting the right answer. And we said it was random. Sometimes you'd get nothing, and sometimes you get a little bit, sometimes you get a lot. But you could win real money for performing well. Now, we did one more random assignment here, where everybody was split into 2 new groups. Some people were told, all the money that you win for this task, you get to keep it all yourself. It goes in your own pocket. But the other set of people were told, you've actually been randomly selected from that little group of 3 that you just played with, and you're going to work, or all the money that you earn for this task, you'll get some of it, but you're actually going to split it evenly amongst you and your team members. So you get a third, and then each of the other people would get a third. And so we told people you can play for as long as you want and quit when you feel like quitting. What we didn't tell people, this is also something that was a little bit behind the scenes here, is that the payouts that you could get for performing well, they decreased really quickly. So I think it was maybe in the first 5 rounds, we'd give you reasonable payouts for good performance. And then after that, it dropped basically to 0 from that point on. So at that point, it's really just a measure of persistence. How long are you willing to keep trying to earn, either for you or for you and your team? So this is just sort of the graphical setup here. Do a test, earn some money, and it either goes in your pocket or in the pocket of your teammates and you. So this is the overall study setup, and this kind of explains our hypothesis. First, we get people in this experience of team exclusion or inclusion. After that, we ask the participant to go and work and persist in a task for their team. And then finally, the question is, in which case, when they were included by their team or excluded by their team, are they willing to work more? Are they willing to work harder and longer? Now, there's 3 possible outcomes here, and this leans a little bit back to the earlier idea we had about how it could be a pro-social outcome, could be an anti-social outcome. One possibility is that the experience that you had with this team just doesn't really matter at all in terms of how long you persist on the follow-up task. You could just have an even, regardless of whether you're included or excluded. Another possibility is that we see that pro-social response that we discussed. So if you had been excluded by your team, you work even harder to get back in their good graces. And then finally, we may see an antisocial response, which is in the exclusion case, that's the orange bar there, you give up much faster because you don't really have any interest in helping out those people who just treated you in that way. So it's got to be one of these three. Either nothing happened or something went up or went down in the case of exclusion. Here's what we found. So in the case where you got to keep all the money for yourself in this task, when you're working for yourself, it turned out team belonging just didn't matter that much. So again, the orange bar here is those people who had been excluded, and the blue bar is people who had been included. The y-axis is how many tasks, how many of those repetitive tasks you did in a row before you finally gave up. And we can see that in either case of team treatment, you did about 20 tasks either way. On the other hand, the team condition really mattered when you were working for your team, perhaps unsurprisingly. When your team treated you as if you were part of the team and you felt like you belonged, you were willing to work just as hard for your teammates as you would for yourself. So that light blue horizontal bar there, that's just the marker from the last slide. That's sort of the benchmark about how hard you worked when you got to keep all the money yourself. We can see that the blue inclusion team, that goes right up to how hard you'd work for yourself. And then there's about a 25% drop in what we might call persistence or performance in the case where your team excluded you. So there's a couple of things worth pointing out here to kind of tie that into some of the ideas that we had before. First of all, when people feel like they don't belong, they not only work less, but because there's still something in it for you when you're splitting the money with you and your team, you get to keep some of that. So you've got to be able to be willing to take some kind of personal penalty just in order to keep the rest of your team from benefiting. And you could even frame that as a kind of sabotage because there's something in it that you're losing too. It must be really important for you to not let those people have those rewards. And that's clearly the antisocial cost of unbelonging. Out of those three options, we're definitely seeing the antisocial pattern here. Now, one of the principles of good science, we believe, is once you get a good finding, you've got to make sure that it holds up to repeated experiments, so replication. And we replicated this 4 different times with different samples of people under slightly different conditions, all with the basic same setup. And we saw the same pattern every time. There was always this antisocial cost. And interestingly enough, across all of the studies, the gap between inclusion and exclusion stayed in a predictable range. So if you were excluded, you always ended up doing somewhere in, let's say, 15 to 16 tasks before you gave up. And if you were included, you always did somewhere around 20. So there was this reliable 25% reduction in engagement and performance for your team when you'd been excluded. And we think of that as the cost of unbelonging. So that was kind of the big takeaway from this round of experiments that we did. Two takeaways really. One, there's definitely an antisocial thing going on here when your team excludes you. And second, there's a very marked cost of getting left out, or as we call it, of unbelonging. Okay, so you might say that we've already covered some good ground here. First, we laid the foundation with our correlational findings showing that business outcomes do track with these sentiments of inclusion and belonging. Then we went one step further to experimentally show that that exclusion or inclusion causes a certain behavior and attitude towards your team. But that really just leaves us with kind of demonstrating the cost of the problem. And one of our principles here at BetterUp is that once we identify the problem, we do our best to try and make it better. So the next question that naturally occurred to us was, well, okay, now that we know that there's a cost, can the damaging effects of unbelonging in some way be undone? And so that was the third and final phase of this research program that we put together to see if there are actually any interventions where we can step in and try and make a difference even after an exclusionary experience has occurred. So just to recap, this is the consistent pattern we have seen over and over again. Your team excludes you, and then you're asked to work more for them, and when asked to do so, you give up early or maybe even sabotage the benefit of your team. Now, what we would hope we could see with a successful intervention is something more like this. Your team excludes you, but now there's some kind of, let's call it a belonging intervention that's injected into that person's experience. And now when they're asked to go back and do more work for their team, we would hope that even though it's still the same people that just excluded you, there's some kind of repair that happens so that you can come back and in some way be revitalized and still be willing to try and push forwards for your team's success. That's our goal here with these ideas of the interventions. So we use the same experimental setup, still pairing people together for this simple collaborative task online. And we tested 3 different belonging interventions, and I'll go over them, each of them briefly. So the names that we gave them were perspective, mentorship, and empowerment. And I just take a minor side note here and point out that each of these terms they have specific meanings from other arenas of study and also in organizational behavioral science. So if these mean anything to you in particular, just sort of hold those definitions off for a little bit, and you'll see why we labeled these the way that we did. On the flip side, of course, if a different word seems more appropriate or whatever, that's fine to keep that in your mind. It's really the action that we brought in through these interventions that we were really focused on. So for example, perspective. Basically the idea that things don't feel so bad when you find out that other people have experienced the same kind of hardship and they found a way to deal with it. And so in this case, we actually went to people who had already gone through our experimental rounds. They'd finished the game, they'd been excluded. And then we said, hey, would you mind writing a little bit about how that felt, what you thought of the other people as a result, and then also how you decided to deal with that uncomfortable experience of being left out. Then we took those writings and we brought them into a new crop of experimental participants who had just played this game with this new team. They'd felt excluded, they weren't feeling very good, and we said, hey, why don't you just have a look at what other people have kind of written as their own reflectives and testimonials about how they went through that, how they learned to cope. Just our hypothesis was that just kind of reading through that and seeing that other people have been through it before and there was some kind of path forward, we felt that that alone may be restorative. So that's what we called the perspective intervention. Now, mentorship is a similar idea, it's just kind of paying it forward. So in this case, we said, imagine having just gone through this exclusionary experience, you see somebody else who's just gone through the same thing. They were left out of their team. What would you, imagine if you had the chance to sit down with them, what would you do or say to them to help them feel better and to help them find a way to repair their own experience? And then we had them kind of write that down, that little thought experiment. So similar to perspective, but this one is you step into the role of mentor and you're helping someone else out. We thought that maybe that in itself might have the effect on you that suddenly you kind of get your feet back under you, you are in the mode of helper rather than victim, and then that's creating a better experience for you going forward. The final type of intervention we called empowerment. This is actually based on some existing literature in psychology, which shows that when people have a feeling of being ostracized or left out of a group, a very common first reaction is to try and regain some sense of control over their environment, something that makes you feel a little bit more secure. So in this case, we said to the people who had just been excluded, imagine you had the power to go and change the rules of that game that you just played so that it was more fair and equitable and even more enjoyable for all of the participants involved. What would you do to change those rules? And we had them write that down too. And now I think it's important to note that we didn't promise them, oh, as soon as you tell us what to do, we're then going to go and act and change the game. It was really just kind of a thought experiment to say, if you were in this mindset of empowerment, how would you go about fixing the problem that just happened? So you can see how each one of these 3 interventions are slightly different. And we think that each of them in their own way has the power to repair an experience of unbelonging. So I've got some text up here of each one of the actual prompts that we used. I'm not going to go through them in detail. You can sort of scan them if you want to while I'm talking. But I did want to cover one important point here, which is you can see under perspective, there's a small section that says perspective control. Now, many experimental designs include something called a control condition, which is essentially saying, well, what if our hypothesis was wrong? What if something kind of less interesting was going on? We should test for that too. And in the perspective condition, we were a little bit worried that maybe just giving people these sort of testimonials to read from people who had gone before maybe it didn't actually have anything to do with how the previous people had found a coping strategy. Maybe it was just kind of taking their mind off of the sting of having been rejected by giving them something to read. Now, if that were true, it shouldn't matter what we give them to read. They should be able to read, some random newspaper article and still essentially feel a little bit better. So in this case, we took some people's writings, their perspectives, that didn't actually have that much to do with the social experience they went through. Some people, for example, said, oh, it's so interesting that science is performed on the internet these days, isn't that cool? Nothing really to do with belonging. And those were the things that we gave people to read in the perspective control condition. Now, the prediction here is that if it's just a distractor, then perspectives about coping with the experience of exclusion and then just random text should have the same effect. But if we're right, and actually it does have a lot to do with hearing about how other people have the same bad experience and move past it, then the control condition shouldn't work and the perspective condition should. So just to lay that out there for you. And then to bring it back to sort of our overall study flow here, the idea is now your group excludes you, then, and I should say that everybody from here on out we're just talking about people in the excluded condition. All of our participants were left out of their group. After that happens now, they're randomly assigned to experience one of these 3 types of belonging interventions. Then we run through the same follow-up task where they can earn for their team. And then we hope that the interventions will have shifted them from acting more as if they were in that exclusion zone into an inclusion zone. Okay, so here's what we found. Turns out that our interventions seemed to work. So the first dot that's showing up here, that's the control condition that I just talked about. And you can see that the dot there doesn't really get out of the exclusion range at all. The little vertical lines around the dot, that's just a measure of variance around the results that we saw. But it's really still squarely in the exclusion range of behavior. Perspective, however, that did get us out of the exclusion range and a fair amount of the way towards acting as if you'd been included all along, although it didn't quite get us all the way there, but still something promising in that intervention. Now, the final 2, mentorship and empowerment, those both really worked. Mentorship landed squarely in the inclusion range of behavior, and empowerment, it seemed to have worked so well that people in that condition worked even harder for the team that just excluded them than the other people who had been included all along were willing to work for their team. So there's something really powerful there, and we're currently looking into that even more to try and understand what's going on there. But the bottom line here is that we saw some good success here. All of the interventions had the effect of repairing people's experience in some way such that they were ready to come back and work for their teams. And we certainly saw this very linear effect between those 3 interventions where empowerment really had the best outcome. So that's basically our takeaway, is that not only, if we just do a quick retrospective here, we were able to connect the dots correlationally, then we were able to show the costs of exclusion and unbelonging in an experimental way, essentially proving that belonging is really what's at the heart of things here. And then finally, we were able to show that even when you don't have that experience of belonging, there are interventions that you can bring to bear that somehow repair your experience and bring you back into the mood of being able to work for your success and for your team's success as well. And so with that, I'm going to turn it back over to Gabriella, and she'll sort of connect the science that we've done into some of the work that we do as a company around coaching.
Awesome. Thanks so much, Andrew. So now that we've done that science and proved out these interventions, the next phase is to take the experimental interventions and translate them into the coaching world and see how they perform in real life with folks in real organizations. And so we thought we'd give you a little look at how we've translated those experimental interventions for our coaches and for our members. So there's sort of 2 use cases where this experimental interventions are useful. One is the employees themselves who are experiencing low belonging and are experiencing a sense of dysphoria, dissatisfaction because they do not feel that they belong. And so in these cases, our coaches are given some training on what are kind of the steps to work this through. with the coachee. So of course, first empathy, acknowledging the difficulty of the experience, asking for the full context, and then letting them know that we have evidence-based exercises that we think will be really helpful to them, and based on the research from BetterUp Labs, and would they like to try some of them out. Our coaches are always invited, encouraged to really personalize this to the employee situation. Coaching is, of course, the most personalized of any kind of developmental intervention. It's really about that one-on-one relationship. And so there's a lot of the coach's expert judgment in figuring out which of these interventions to try, how to position it for them. So the first intervention is around empowerment, which we saw was the most impactful in terms of restoring an employee's willingness to work for their team. Now, Andrew mentioned that the prompt in empowerment is to really think creatively about how you would go about fixing the situation of exclusion. There is no guarantee in that fix will be put into place. And what's really nice about bringing this to life in the coaching situation is that the coachee knows the coach is outside their workplace, knows that the coach has no particular power to enforce these, the ideas they come up with within the workplace. It's really about working creatively together to think about how it could be different. And then from there, certainly, and of course, there are conversations about, well, how could you take action steps to bring this to life? But even taking the lessons and thinking about in the future event where you do have the opportunity to impact this, how will you, is extremely restorative and empowering for people. The second piece here is mentorship, and so there's quite a lot that you can do for people who are feeling a sense of belonging to help encourage them, to help others, to take this potentially negative experience and use it as a way to bring light to others. And it's a really healing and restorative way to move forward from that experience. There's a lot that our coaches can do in that regard. And our coaches can even ask, share this wisdom with me. Can I, as a coach, share this with other people that I'm coaching who are going through the same experience? And so the coach can actually kind of be the vector of sharing that mentor wisdom in the absence of other opportunities. And then finally, perspective. So in this case, the coach, if they have a perspective of their own, of course they can share. If they have perspective of others, that they can share with the individual. But they also are encouraging these individuals to seek perspective from others who may have been through similar experiences. Now, almost everyone that we're coaching, including many of the same people who are experiencing unbelonging themselves, also want to be a source of inclusion for others. And this could be as a leader from the top or as a colleague from within. They want to know how to help others avoid this sense of unbelonging and how to proactively create a sense of belonging for others. And so these strategies have the same sort of implications for what they mean for helping others who are in these situations. And so our coaches are, of course, encouraged initially to acknowledge both to celebrate the desire of the coachee to be an inclusive leader, an inclusive colleague, to also acknowledge the very realistic challenges for their particular situation. They'll have a lot of context around what is the team dynamic, what's the organizational dynamic, what are the reasons that this might be difficult. They're encouraged to ask and understand deeply what are the strategies that have already been tried so far, and what does everyone in the organization learn from what has and hasn't worked. And then to personalize, again, these potential interventions based on the context of that coachee. For in some cases, empowerment makes more sense. In some cases, mentorship or perspective is going to make more sense as a way to help others. And so in this case, the empowerment prompt is about how do you help others feel empowered to speak up about how to improve things. For leaders, there's quite a lot they can do to create space for those ideas and to take action on those ideas. And for colleagues, there's ways of partnering and aligning yourself with the empowerment suggestions to help bring them to life. On the mentorship and perspective side, this is an opportunity to listen, to connect, to learn wisdom from people who are going through these experiences, and to put yourself in the position of a mentee, which is really creates an opportunity for that mentorship for the individual, or to connect them with others for whom you think their mentorship can be useful. And then on the perspective side, this is sort of the inverse of that is, are there others? Do you have your own perspectives? We've all experienced a sense of unbelonging and exclusion. Can you share how you coped with it and what it felt like for you with those individuals? And that will create a really deep place of connection from a kind of vulnerability around your own experience of exclusion. So we'll wrap up here. We've now launched this out to our network, and we're watching how it performs. So how much in real life do all of these interventions now move the needle on people's feelings of inclusion in the workplace? And we're excited to carry forward both in that way and with some follow-up studies that we're doing at the lab. But that is the general overview that we hope to provide. And again, in summary, we hope we're able to provide some good ammunition for you all to make the business case for why belonging is the causal element in people not performing when they feel excluded by their teams. And for the fact that there are things that we can do to help, and there are highly personalized interventions that can help to move the needle to restore that performance and help impact the bottom line. We have a report which we'll share more about in a few minutes that you can access to get the full readout on all these findings. So if you were scribbling notes, don't worry, we've got you covered. But I think now we wanted to hand it back to Alec for some Q&A.
All right, Gabriella. Yeah, we are going to get into Q&A. If you have a question, don't hesitate to submit in the Q&A section there on the right-hand side of your screen. And we have one in here already, so I'm going to send this one to you first here, Gabriella, and this comes from Brad. Brad's question is, are certain types of roles, for example, individual contributor that tends to operate in isolation, et cetera, are those certain type of roles impacted more by exclusion or unbelonging?
Yeah, thank you so much. It's a great question. So in fact, we see that managers and managers of managers do feel a greater sense of belonging at work. They tend to score higher, which means that, you know, by implication, those ICs out on the front line do tend to score lower. So as you hypothesize, it's true that folks out on the front line are more vulnerable to feeling a lower sense of belonging at work.
All right, perfect. Thank you. This one came in during Andrew's portion, and Justice was just looking for some clarification. So Justice's question is, were the subjects included or excluded the second time around after the intervention? I'm not sure if you mentioned that.
Yeah, thanks for your question. So the only experience that in the design that people had of exclusion or inclusion was that first collaborative game where people were tossing the ball around. And then it was kind of like how they felt after that carried through all the subsequent tasks. In the intervention conditions, all of the data that we reported on was for people who had just been in the excluded condition.
All right, perfect. Well, thank you both. We don't have any more questions in there yet, but I'm going to give out a last call here. So please feel free to submit your questions in the Q&A portion on the side of your screen. So actually, it looks like we have a few coming in here. So give me a second to filter through. Okay. Here's one from Vicky, and we'll send this to you, Gabriella. And Vicky's question is, do you see any specific strategies to induce inclusion and belonging during an acquisition?
Oh, that's such a great question. Thanks, Vicki. So, right, of course, during an acquisition, you have two groups who are coming together and see each other as the other and need to now come to some sense of cohesion. So, you know, in those situations, the types of relationships you want to be forming are typically going to be at the peer level. Those are people are really experiencing a lot of the same things. So uncertainty about this new group coming in, uncertainty about their own positions, and is there anything in jeopardy there? Social support is extremely critical for well-being during the time of the acquisition. That's something that we've seen quite a bit of. And in terms of strategies, the more that you can do to create these cohesive groups across the two bodies coming together at that peer level, the better. You don't want to kind of force relationships, but giving people opportunities to spend time, get to know each other, get to share their experiences. A lot of that will happen organically. And to break down those walls so they can start to experience the fact that they're going through the same things, just from their own sort of within their own cultures. So just to sum that up, I think it's a great question. It's a huge challenge. Working at that peer level and giving place for people to connect and be vulnerable in a way that is not forced but is authentic, can start to form some solid connections and social support that can preempt negative outcomes in terms of well-being.
There's one thing I'd add on to that, Gabriela, which is it reminds me of some previous research that we've done on social isolation and loneliness. And what we found in those cases is that, as Gabriela mentioned, having social support is key, but there's different ways you can have social support. You can have everybody get together for coffee, and that could arguably be increasing social support, but that wasn't the main driver that really brought people together. What we found is that the secret sauce to a socially supportive workplace, especially with new people coming in, like with an acquisition, is creating a shared sense of purpose. And I think especially for when you're bringing together two entirely separate organizations and putting them together, that should be really top of mind. The sooner that you can get everybody feeling like they're working towards a common cause, the more belonging people should feel.
That's such a great addition.
Awesome. Yeah, thank you both. And I think a lot of that will tie into this next question. But Vivian's question is, how do you manage the sense of belonging with remote workers or, smaller field locations?
As someone who's often a remote worker myself, that definitely speaks to me. In fact, my entire team that I work with is remote. And so it's something that's top of mind for me quite a bit. And I think that the nice thing about the space of thinking about belonging and social connection and inclusion is that the things that work tend to work universally. Of course, it's great to be in person when you can be, but the basic tools of the trade, so to speak, whatever the equivalent is of tossing the ball, whether it's if we're having a video meeting, making sure that everybody's included, inviting, maybe even over-inviting input and connection from the remote teams, bringing people together when you can, like all of those same things are the things that you'd do if everybody was in a meeting room in person. And so I think just being extra aware of kind of bringing it back to basics you can never really go wrong with. And I think at least I've seen on my team that just following the same essential formula of, make people feel like they're part of the team, not a part, is something that works really well.
One thought to add on there. So we finished last year a study with Dr. Sonia Lubomirsky at UC Riverside. She's the chair of the psychology department there. And we looked with her and her team at what kinds of acts create the greatest sense of social connection. And we looked at this both for remote and for on-site workers. And what we found was consistent across the remote and on-site workers. And that was that the kinds of acts that create that sense of social connection are the ones where there's something called synchronous interaction. So that means real-time interaction. So that of course would include, going for coffee, which is not possible with a remote worker. But just as good as going for coffee was having a video chat or having a phone call. What's not as good, and what we rely on too much in general, and especially with remote workers, are emails, text messages, Slack messages. Those things do have an impact, but they are far less impactful than picking up the phone or getting on a video chat with someone. And so as Andrew mentioned, there is this sort of basic formula for human connection that is accessible to us via these technologies of, the phone and the video. And it's a matter, it seems to be, of hygiene in making sure that you're accessing those synchronous methodologies and real-time interactions with remote workers just as much as you would be if you were in office and happened to pass someone's desk and, have a conversation.
All right, great. We're moving along. We have one more question in here. It comes from Morgan. Morgan's question is, how do your coaches handle the person who is actually doing the excluding?
That is such a great question. Thank you for asking it. So when we start our coaching, everyone goes through a self-assessment, and then in many cases a 360 as well. And so part of the journey that's baked in is a journey of growing self-awareness. If we have someone who's going through coaching who is in any way, practicing suboptimal or even toxic leadership behaviors, one of the best things that we can do is help them to gain awareness of the fact that they're doing that. And so one of the first ways that they're able to do that is to sort of see the scores that come back for them on areas of inclusive leadership. And the test is designed such that you can't kind of game the system. It's able to pick up on these elements of how you think you want other people to see you versus how you're actually performing. And so from there, with coaching, the coach is able to talk to that person about their level of motivation to change that. And so in the case of someone who's excluding, in the vast majority of cases, people don't want to be, they don't want to be hurtful to others. They don't, there's a very small percentage of sociopaths out there, and fortunately there's not a lot we can do about that, except motivate them by their own self-interest, which is probably a topic for another webinar. But for the vast majority of people who really do want to, at least not harm others, helping them be aware of the impact is important. And then figuring out what's really going to motivate them to make the behavioral changes that are necessary. And for each person, that motivation is going to be different. For some people, it's going to be about advancing your career, and you're not going to be able to advance in your career with these practices. For others, it's about deeply understanding the impact that those actions are having on others, and being motivated by not wanting to cause that impact. So the coaches then work with those individuals to figure out what is going to be the source of motivation for them to change. In some cases, the coach can suggest that they do a 360, which is where others in their organization will give them feedback, and that's part of our platform, and no additional cost or anything, just part of the opportunity to grow in terms of self-awareness. And hearing from others about those kinds of behaviors is sometimes what people need in order to be really motivated to make the change. So it's a little bit of an answer. There's probably a lot more we can say, and would love to chat about it offline as well.
All right, great. We're gonna cut things here. So Andrew and Gabriella, thank you both. And Gabriella, I know we have a little bit more information on the report here. If you want to go ahead and keep this.
Yeah. Thanks, Alex. So we gave you an overview of some of the top findings from our study. The full report is available on our website, and I think Alex is going to give you the link to download it. This gives you, something nice that you can share with others in your organization. Again, hopefully that ammo that you need to get investment to work on this problem for your organizations. We're also available for questions, and as you digest it and share with others, they may come up, and would love to hear your thoughts and also suggestions for other kinds of things that we could study that would be helpful to you. Thank you.
Thanks, everyone.
Yeah, again, thank you, Andrew and Gabriella, for that. I also want to take this time right now to thank today's sponsors over at BetterUp for sponsoring the webinar. Through their leadership development platform and on-demand virtual coaching, BetterUp is helping professionals around the globe pursue their lives with greater clarity, purpose, and passion. And to learn more, visit betterup.co. So again, thank you to BetterUp for sponsoring. It's always a pleasure to work with the folks over there. Again, thank you to everybody on the line. Thanks to our audience members. Thanks to Andrew and Gabriella. We'll see you all back here for our next workforce webinar taking place this coming Tuesday at noon Eastern, titled Supercharge Employee Training with High-Powered Learning Content. Thanks again, everybody, and have a great day.
Happy Halloween.